Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the seminar, Art Writing Against the Grain Towards a New Criticism, with instructors Sean Tatol. Before I hand it over to Sean, I'll introduce the seminar. Art criticism has become a hot topic recently, and after a long period of repressed dormancy in the art world, even the forces that formerly sought to smother criticality out of existence now give lip service to the need for criticism. However, this has not coincided with an improved understanding of criticism's means or ends, which sets the stage for an important critical turn. This seminar will seek to remedy that blindness by studying the history of contemporary art's move away from criticism alongside examples of criticism's successes and failures. Neither the left's self-satisfied identity politics nor the right's reactionary provocations present a way back to art as something more than a political signification, and we must recover precisely the terms of art's irreducibility if a new criticism is to emerge. To do so, we must understand how those terms change in the latter parts of the 20th century, how they degenerated into inarticulate relativism, how that relativity expresses itself even in those who seek to resist it, and how it can be possible to apply new terms of valuation in a hostile climate. Sean Tatol is an art critic based in New York City. He writes primarily on his website, The Manhattan Art Review. The Manhattan Art Review favors short-form reviews of art exhibitions with a 5-star rating system, prioritizing strong and potentially divisive opinions in contradiction to the polite conventions of mainstream art writing. By this approach, he aims to emphasize the importance of judgment in art criticism in the hopes of fostering a functional arts discourse that welcomes disagreement, debate, and renewed attempts to grapple with the complexities of art. Sean, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thanks. So hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. So I guess, well, I'll start by saying that I have no formal background in teaching, so I'm not going to be sort of delivering a lecture as such. So please, hopefully, some dialogue starts happening because I don't really know how to I can riff, but I can't really, I don't have a paper prepared or lined up or anything. So, once there's some back and forth, I think we'll be just fine. But it's funny sort of listening back to the description of the course that I wrote before I had assembled the writings for it. Not because I changed it that much. I mean, I think it's certainly the readings are more sort of art historical and art theoretical and less criticism based than maybe I initially intended. But I think the goal of the class or the sort of the trajectory I have in mind is sort of a another sort of more succinct way to put what I put in the description is just that I'm interested in dealing with sort of art since the 60s or postmodernism or what's happened in the time since then, and trying to reconcile that sort of break with history that people believed was happening at the time, and refusing sort of I think the kind of current of whatever like polarized mainstream discourse has you could reduce it broadly to a rejection of sort of postmodernism as such, as sort of a mistake that we should forget about, and we should just go back to modernism or earlier, and it's all just decadence or something. And then on the other side, the group that sort of sticks to sort of the 60s mindset that we've kind of swept the slate clean and should stick to it. I think both sides are untenable, and I think an easy way to sort of put it as in terms of what I'm interested in what I've been thinking about lately is that I think we're the current conditions that we have now are that postmodernity is now at a point where it is historical enough that we can historicize it and see it as a past phenomenon, and in seeing it as something that happened in the past that's distinct from the present, we can frame and organize our thoughts around it in a new way. We can reevaluate it and sort of distinguish its successes and its failures and sort of separate the wheat from the chaff. And I don't think the contemporary discourse is doing that yet. But I think to move forward, we need to do that. So it's kind of a weird lineup of readings, I guess. I mean, to kind of go through each one, it was sort of like the Sakula article was sort of stating the baseline, postmodern take from his particular position. Stephen Melville's aspects is reflecting on conceptualism, which is sort of distinct from Sakula's, but a related sort of consideration of what all these sort of changes to sort of the normative discourse around art, those sort of leaps that happened after the 60s, what those were leading to. Danto's After the End of Art, that chapter is more sort of about a 90s position of this sort of idea that, kind of a end of history Fukuyama type position of sort of presuming that things are definitively changed in a way that I think history since then has proved it was simply a brief historical period, and that history is sort of starting again, so that the sort of conclusions he's making there were a lot more sweeping than I think he should have been trying for. Then we have T.J. Clarke's painting of postmodern life, which was sort of him reflecting on modernism, which he likes to do, but with a sort of interesting reintegration of what he thinks about contemporary art, and Tony Orsler and this digital art stuff, which is interesting coming from Clarke, because he kind of refuses to admit the present exists most of the time. And then Suhail Malik's lectures on exiting contemporary art, which are kind of hard to summarize, but I mean, I first watched them when they were like a year or two old, like 10 years ago. And I thought they were a very good sort of diagnosis of how the art world was at the time. And I think a lot of the sort of assumptions underlying it, even as the art world's changed, have remained sort of implicitly the same. And I think it's still a very good diagnosis. And I actually like his conclusions more now than I think I did 10 years ago. But I think there's also sort of underlying assumptions that he's making that are sort of still involved or sort of preoccupied with this sort of 60s, post 60s, postmodern sort of you know, him talking about the anarcho-realist maxim, he sort of um, brings that up as a sort of, you know, absolute fact about the nature of artists and art. But I think that it's actually that's a big assumption to make, and I think it's a very sort of um, brash statement to make about anything sort of before the 60s. That the sort of utopian aspiration, I think there's always a utopianism in art, but I think the idea that you can make it real sort of is something that only sort of occurs in the last 60 years. Before then, I don't, you know, no one really thought a painting of heaven was going to make heaven on earth. I think that so um those are there. So that's, you know, I think that's where my reservations with what Malik's project is stating. That's where my problems with it start. But um I don't know. I can just kind of start rambling about something, but or does anyone have any comments or concerns or thoughts about anything that they liked or didn't, or um I mean anything really? No. Yeah, Lynn.
Um, yeah, I mean, I don't have maybe a particular question, but I did watch the lectures and read the texts. And I mean, I find it interesting to a certain extent how they connect with each other or how they speak, because I think that the text of T.J. Clark, of course, it refuses modern, like the contemporary art, the art that concurrent to his lecture. And he tries to basically define the contemporary situation by its negation or by centering it towards modernism, which I guess he just knows much better. And also he just doesn't even pay attention to what postmodernism could be, because as I understood from his text, he basically considers it a joke or like making fun or mocking modernism without really taking it seriously into account. And so that's what he tries to do with his lecture. And then Sekula is basically the opposite, because he denies the idea of modernism. Well, not completely, but he thinks that it can contribute to decepting working class or people who are in the position of being exploited, and can be this function, ideological function, so to say, of fulfilling the things which are not present in real life. And so therefore he tries to propose a new kind of art which would go completely against institutions and be independent. And then that's sort of where Malik's lecture pick up, because this is already the point where this view has become institutionalized, exactly because institutions are now basically saying that we should produce art which is against institutions, which is paradoxical in itself. And of course, it kind of has been the status quo maybe of the last decades. And in this sense, I do agree with Foucauldian solution, which Malik proposes, that to accept that art is inseparable from institutions, as the very idea that we think that it can be autonomous basically is hypocritical to a certain extent, because we are all participating still in these games of power. So saying that we are part of institutions could imply that we can change the institutions by taking the responsibility. But that's where I have a lot of problems with it, because as a person who is rather, well, I'm not an artist, I'm a composer actually, so it's a bit different in that realm, but still a lot of structures are similar. But from what I witnessed, there is not really a possibility to change the system while being an artist, because you have, or by being not a very well-established artist, so you have to have the position in the system in order to change the way institutions function. And that's also a tautology in itself, because in order to do so, you would have to play by the game that institutions propose. And by the time you could possibly get the position, it could probably be impossible to change the whole thing, because by now you would have too much experience of playing by its rules, I would assume. So yeah, this is kind of what I was thinking by reading it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great summary sort of the terms of it. And I think, there's a lot, you hit on a lot of good points. I think there's I think, yeah, these sort of tautological problems of sort of critique with regards to contemporary art are sort of a the central issue. Like I think sort of like a way to put it with sort of Malik, for instance, is that, he wants to, create new institutions, new, more just institutions, more, whatever, more utopian, better things. He wants things to improve. But the problem that I sort of see it on it is that there's a sort of like bootstrapping involved in there, which on the one hand, what you bring up, which is absolutely true, and I think, really glaring as a sort of downturn from 10 years ago. I think that there was more sort of a sense of there being sort of resources out there for alternative institutions. And, I think the optimism was tempered, but there was at least some optimism. I think, like being in the art world, I was pretty like dipping my toes in at this point, but really, like as soon as Trump got elected, I think that there was a decisive sort of belief in the future in general that sort of took a serious sort of blow that's never recovered since 2016. And I think so that's just as make an observation, basically, that institutions didn't once seem so hopeful, a decade ago. Now they hopeless. I mean, they feel totally like untouchable now. And, there's this sort of presumption, a rightful presumption that, you kind of have to play the game by the rules to, get in the door. So what possible chance is there to move outside of it? And so so this is the problem, is that it's sort of like, okay, we should build better institutions. One, with what money, what resources, how are we going to do that? And then two, like, where do you find people with these sort of whatever, like more progressively righteous moral views of art making and sort of alternative strategies, like these things, to find the people to do these things who aren't fundamentally sort of people who are sort of molded by the system in their process of joining up with it. Um it's almost kind of an intractable kind of problem, that is scary. But so where that leads me is um like I think, if I look at the Sakula essay, there's a certain um political utopianism in that I find almost not trite, or I don't want to use like negative terms about it. It's there's an optimism that I find impossible to sort of sympathize with personally, just based on my understanding of sort of the cultural climate compared to 50 years ago. And so so there's that, I think, tempering that I think needs to happen towards sort of processing that outlook in the first place. Um, but then I also have to like kind of catch myself and realize that, um, being exposed to Sakula, in my early 20s was someone that was a like authentically important sort of step in my own sort of understanding of politics and, systems and uh just sort of like understanding the world and sort of like a positive indoctrination to a type of leftism that I hadn't been exposed to before. So like there's an interesting wavering there between uh my own hesitancy towards his ideals, but the actual like proof that what he did was important to my own development and my own sort of um pursuing things as I've done since then. And um similarly, I mean, the reason I came across Sakula in the first place and really got into contemporary art at all was that I was involved with a art center in Portland that's since closed called Yale Union. And I think um, that was really a exemplary project of kind of what Malik wanted at the time. And I think, the people who were involved with that had definitely close ties to artist space and, Malik's world. Like, I think there was a lot sort of in common, a sort of um, resonance sort of in the projects of what Malik was talking about and what Yale Union was trying to do. I think there was so like when I first watched these videos, whatever 2016 or 15 or something, I kind of rolled my eyes almost because I was like, oh, you just want to build institutions. It's just like Yale Union, the place I already have been involved with. Like that's no great sort of insight to bring up. But now I look back at it and it's like, well, yeah, I think actually the fact that I was involved with this institution that sort of gave me a primer course in sort of a well-chosen sort of program of um I don't know, I guess good contemporary art was really formative for me and integral for everything I do now. So it's sort of like uh it's just interesting that I catch my own critiques of or sort of misgivings about these projects. Um, I have like misgivings intellectually reading about them, but then I think about, sort of myself and sort of the I'm like proof positive of what's being argued for in these modes of thought. So it almost makes me, question my own criticisms of it on some level. I think on the sort of on that level of sort of they're saying something correct that is like true and helpful. And then on the other hand, it's sort of um, looking sort of at the sort of cultural landscape. I think the positions being stated are perhaps um, just unworkable in the contemporary situation, and so that sort of begs the question of where these sort of arguments can go now in a changed sort of far more uh, cynical sort of cultural situation. Um, but let me see. Uh, so I think um, to yeah, yeah, Julian.
Can you hear me? My mic is kind of bad.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was kind of I kind of agreed with what you just said about you being proof positive, but I also disagree in the sense that I think that like with the Malik piece or the secular piece, like they're both like well intentioned effectively, right? Like
Yep.
they're going for something good. But I feel like the breakdown is really in the kind of like execution of that kind of like desire to come up with a certain body of theory or a certain kind of like framework, whatever. And so I'm not really inclined to think that like you are proof positive of what they're arguing for, because the specifics of what they're arguing for like isn't, at least in my like readings of these kind of like separate things, it's not really you. Like I feel like Secula is, he's going for like a very specific thing that has to do with like a political form of art, right? Where like, and that is what matters, period, right? And then I think with Malik, like I didn't watch all of the lectures, and so I might have gotten this, I might have misunderstood this also based on the kind of like response. But I feel like there was a lot of like, it felt very ontological. Like it felt very like top down, like this is what art, like art and artists and institutions are, or something like that, as opposed to what you just articulated, which I think is a much more interesting thing to go for, which is like an institution outside of the institutional art world that does good art. Do you know what I mean? Like it's slightly more specific. And I only say that because I'm not inclined to give them credit for those things if they didn't actually like go for them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's, I think your critiques are correct. And I do think, that's what I was trying to, look at my notes for, was to sort of get to my own points sort of where the rubber hits the road with my own sort of criticisms of sort of the limits of their positions. And yeah, and I think, the sort of this idea of like a uh independent institution that supports like good art, like that's, a simple notion, but I think sort of the that's actually an easy sort of way to sort of frame exactly what I have in mind for this course, which is like that we can say that there should be things that support good art, and that's an okay thing to say, and you can say it, and whatever, you can, like, good art, I think, for a good 50 years or something, is sort of like, was like a dirty sort of um like reactionary term, like this sort of idea of quality being like a, something that only what's his name, the new Criterion guy, would talk about. What is his name? But that I think, the sort of postmodern critique, politicized, etc. mode is simply more reconcilable with sort of these older ideas of sort of qualitative judgment than the, in the last 50 years or so, people were phobic of sort of the elitism of, of judgment, say. But I think judgment is simply just a factual sort of component of art, and that you can, incorporate sort of lessons and information from the last 50, 60 years of art, and include judgment, because I think that these sort of yeah, I mean, I'm not going to try to like define it right now, but I think that there's an sort of ontological basis for judgment in art um that I think, yeah, is open to be reevaluated, but not in a traditionalist sense. Yeah, Michelle?
Yeah, do you think that maybe a lot of that is because of the internet and like how we can actually like see more art. Like, does that make sense? Like I just wonder if like before they were like, well, like all the good art rules were like patriarchal, you know,
Hmm.
then they had to push up against that. And now
Hmm.
now it's like everyone's art can be seen, so we have to go back to some kind of filter, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a huge part of it, is I think that's sort of like the thesis of sort of what I've been thinking about recently, is that there's, I think, a divisive change created by the internet, where sort of artists and if I wanted to like hazard like a little bit of a schema for it, it's sort of like that um art after the 60s or something becomes sort of a cultural mode, either through like academia or art scenes in New York or whatever, where it's sort of there's a subculture or a sort of like a cultural discourse of sort of these sort of small groups that are sort of critiquing and rejecting sort of the long arc of history as being sort of um, an oppressive outside other format. Um, but what I think has happened, I think, like Malik is interesting because he's sort of at that sort of inflection point of the end where sort of it's right before sort of the internet, sort of social media, sort of like overcoming of all of like our social fabric, um, before it becomes totalizing. So he's sort of still on this like very end of this notion of sort of what I think Danto is arguing for, is this sort of like end of art, sort of like post, you know, like whatever, post-Soviet, post like yeah, liberal consensus world order that was sort of shaken up starting in 2016 and has gotten more and more involved since then. But so what I think happens is that the what the internet has done is sort of eradicated these sort of smaller networks that drove culture through the 60s to the 10s. But what it does is, by kind of diffusing and atomizing sort of the framework of culture, by exposing us to so much sort of information in such a broad scope, the the idea of sort of, on a basic level, sort of like believing in your own sort of culture or your subculture as a a real thing with a real like objectivity that isn't sort of relativized by your knowledge of everything else. That's what people used to rely on. Like, to use like a trite example, it's like, you wanted to be into music in the 70s, then like you went to CBGB's and you saw the bands there, and that's what you did. Like now, the internet just completely like is like an atom bomb on like your temporal understanding of what's contemporary, and like that's really throws off any sort of grounding in a sort of contemporary, which I think is exactly what Malik is diagnosing, like kind of before the fact, is that contemporary art is sort of caught up in its own contemporariness without actually being able to uh okay, Senza, what's boomer?
Boomer opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying it sounds boomerish to say like the internet is just like an atom bomb onto the way we comprise temporality when we talk about contemporary and about contemporary art as well. Because in a sense, I mean that's the gist of it, right? Like the thing that art is not necessarily like something humans do tied to spatial conditions necessarily. I do think that it's like politics. Art maybe tries to play a long time to pertain itself throughout time, and that's why it reproduces through institutions. That's why it has been commodified so effectively, right? That's what I see like boomerish. Like if it's an atom bomb, following that thread, that metaphor, so what? Like literally, maybe it's like limp argument or comparison what I'm gonna do now, but living at a world like nowadays where bombs are like common currency day to day, like actual nuclear bombs, and to say that, for example, those sort of things are not necessarily impacting our temporal or spatial point of view, and to say that rather internet is, seems innocuous to me.
Yeah, I mean, so all I'm saying is that I think there's a decisive change in the way we relate to society in the world. And I think, the thing is, that there's a, you know, clear shift, sort of whatever the desensitization of media and, sort of whatever the depiction of violence through the news, and the insensitivity to what's happening, it's just basic, like, whatever, like wars and stuff are one thing, but then it's, just sort of anything like whatever, the inevitability of sort of the circulation of information that sort of bombards you constantly with, school shootings and violence and, whatever, like death everywhere, etc. Like those things you didn't used to be exposed to those things, and your worldview was smaller and more contained to like the world that you were living in. And now that we're exposed to all these things, I think it just fundamentally shifts our perception of the world.
Yeah,
And I think
I agree. I will say that I do see the correlation, but I don't necessarily see a causality. I don't necessarily see a causal relationship, like some sort of consequential relationship between one and another. But I do see the correlation. I do think it's true, though.
Can I ask you to clarify, Senza, really quick? But when you say causality, what are the two things you're talking about?
Exposition to information and desensitization, or a sort of demystification or de-enchantment of the aesthetic experience. Here discussed through art, and for example, putting the example of war and stuff, it's also that sensitivity, right? Like it's also being exposed to that cognitive dissonance that one can perceive positively through the art spectrum, and negatively nowadays, I don't know why, through the journalist and informational spectrum. I see correlation, but I do not see causality, because the world is so fucked up. So many things happen so many times. I don't know if...
I am a visual artist, and I do see causality. If you look at my stuff behind me, this would not have sold in the 60s because it's not the aesthetics of cruelty. Like, because before the internet, we had to see with like, like photojournalism or art photography or things like that, we had to send people to war zones to get photography. We don't do that anymore in art world. We like, I've seen a huge shift in the way that art is because of the internet has saturated that whole thing of like photojournalism for the sake of like seeing the tragedy or whatever, you know what I mean? Like now it's like, we have like the aesthetics of like hope and playfulness, and like, like art is trying to kind of like counteract, like it's almost like in conversation to that, like that aesthetics of cruelty that was in the past. So I do think that there is, for me as an artist, I see a definite jump or a shift in just aesthetic values in that way. Because all of these paintings behind me that I made, and I like, are about dark shit, but like they are in neon and like bright colors and things like that, because I like, it's at this point, I don't want to make art that is as visually painful as the subject matter. And that is like a shift. That's a huge shift, because if you look at art from like the past, even like if you look at famous photographers like Latoya Ruby Frazier, her art is photojournalistic, but it's still like a collectivist, like hope-based bent. You know what I mean? Like she's not photographing the pain. And I think that that's something that we've really moved away from in our world. But anybody's free to disagree with me. Please do if you want. Yeah.
I agree with what you're saying, actually. I will say that point taken. There is a causal relationship right there. But I wouldn't call that something novel.
Uh,
I was just thinking on, for example, Cabaret Voltaire and those sort of movements which come across the in-war period throughout the 20th century. And for example, in that same line, I've seen some approaches or artistic depersonalized exercises of art which happen at these main geographical hotspots of what we consider art nowadays, like what Sean was mentioning. I'm not. I kind of like doing some basic stalking for this seminar. I noticed that your work through the Manhattan Art Review kind of algorithmically aligns with a lot of things that I'm into and that currently happen in New York, and I will say that are even algorithmically adjacent onto what the New Center does. And there's like this dude which does this program called Scorned by Muses, where he
Oh yeah.
talks about art criticism, and there's an episode where he mentions this thing like, if one cares about art, in a sense, one should also care about living in a world where art is not necessarily needed. And because at the same time it works as escapism, as a scapegoat. And it's way more insidious to think about this sort of escapism if it's completely co-opted and commodified by a certain type of mode of production, as they call it. I will say that, once again, that escapism happens all throughout the art history, at least from the inward period of the globalized world in the last 200 years. But I'm not sure, once again, if people who like art or who are into artistic shit are really into imagining or recodifying a world where that statement can become true. Like, do we really need art? And in that same line, do we really need to
well,
make
okay,
art
I mean,
criticism
let's
relevant?
I mean, okay, like I think Taylor's an idiot. Let's just say that.
I'm from
We
South
were in
America. I don't
we
know
were in a
shit. I don't know
reading group
squat.
together years ago. I think he knows absolutely nothing about art. I mean, I know he hates art. He doesn't care about art, which is why he says things like we should live in a world without art. I think it's Taylor does Scorned by Muses. I think like, I think he's a Philistine, someone who has no like
It
value
is.
of
It
art
is.
for him. So obviously it's easy for him to say like, oh yeah, we should get rid of that. And like I think the thing, like I don't want to like,
No,
derail
you can go ahead. I
into
need
a
to be
screed,
to this
but
for the like as a sparring session. A sparring session is what I'm looking for in this.
yeah. But so the thing I think that bothers me sort of about the fundamental statement of like a world without art is it's like who gave you this insight into the human condition that determines that art is like a expendable sort of like side thing. Like I don't like I don't understand like anyone who's read you know Kafka and had it change their life. Like what world do you live in where it's like, yeah, let's get rid of that? Like I don't understand. Like I think it's such a insane like
does he just
refusal to
live in
sort
a
of
vacuum and like never go to movies or like, you know what I mean?
yeah, I
Like,
don't understand like like someone who believes that they're like first person experience of like I don't know what he thinks his communist future would look like, but like one where like art is gone, but you live in like communism, so like work isn't oppressive, like so you just feel like good like walking and you don't need like I don't understand what a
does that
world without art is
does that
basically.
play into the really antiquated theory that you're like you only make art from a place of pain and not joy?
I don't
Because
I
he's
don't
like,
know
we
about
need
I don't know
art,
that
like, you know what I
I don't
mean?
know
Like,
that notion.
oh, because like there's this whole thing in the medical field where for a long time they used to say that like Van Gogh painted because he was crazy, when really he painted his best works in the asylum when he was on medication and he was being like monitored and fed 3 meals a day. Like he objectively painted his best works when he was well as he could be. So like, and then he died when he was released. And so I think that like there's this idea that like Virginia Woolf was a great writer because of her mental health issues, and so I think that that has been outgrown in a like for a couple decades, but like I wonder if that plays into the idea that like we don't need art because art is something that we only need because it serves our pain.
Well, in Taylor's case, it's because he's like a Marxist who thinks like having feelings is like reactionary.
Well, I mean,
Um,
I don't know this
It kind of
guy who
is.
you're referencing, but I think that from how I could interpret it, that there is indeed a big issue that a big part of art is criticizing the social condition or somehow analyzing how the world is structured. So I would assume that the premise is that in the world where we would not need the criticism, we shouldn't have an instrument for criticizing at all, because this would be a reality where there won't be any social turbulences. But of course, I mean, I don't believe actually that such a reality could exist at all, even in the best scenario where, I don't know, we all have just positions in society and that there is no humiliation, no violence. I mean, this sounds a bit like not just unrealistic, but I would say just dangerous projection, because this is kind of a utopia which could cause, in my opinion, a movement towards even a more totalitarian regime, because it's not critical to its own embodiment and social reality. So it's not critical to the fact that as long as there are more than one person, there is space also for conflicts, for various opinions, and so that not each disagreement, so to say, is necessarily negative. I mean, of course, there are big discrepancies between injustice and conflicts, for example. But anyway, I think that the idea that we could achieve reality where no criticism whatsoever would be necessary, it means to basically also get rid of the possibility that humans could grow, could change, could become, and that we as individuals and as society are always in condition of change. So yeah, I mean, but this would be how I would interpret it in general, that there is this double role of art, that on one hand, it's something that gives purpose or meaning to a lot of lives. I mean, to my life, for instance, but it's also it's so much funded in this criticism and this opposition to the world, which is unjust and unfair.
yeah, I think that's reminds me of sort of like a stock joke I make sometimes, is just like that, it's good the institutions are so unjust, because if they became just, then all those institutional critique artists would be out of a job. Like, like if like I think there's a truth to like if your approach to art is entirely grounded in criticality, then um it it draws the line of sort of like, well, what do you actually want? What are you affirming? Like, is there a a positive scope to sort of
Like
what
solutions
you're looking
focused, yeah.
at? Hmm?
It's not like solutions focused. It's very
Yeah.
like problem focused, but yeah.
Yeah. And so, and I think, that's sort of like the getting all thrown off, but yeah, I think there's
I think Julian wants to say something.
Oh yeah.
Well, Sean, you said something earlier, and
Yeah.
then we kind of went down this big thing, which
Yeah.
it feels like we're now just talking about political art and like the purposes or fault or whatever. And like, okay,
Yeah.
that is important. And but you said something interesting earlier that had to do with like why it is that we don't make effectively value judgments, right? Which is something
Mhm.
you've written about.
Mhm.
And then the kind of like one idea that was brought up was the internet, right? Which I somewhat kind of find convincing, I somewhat don't. But I do think that I think that that's like a really interesting question because that is unambiguously the kind of like prevailing way of how things go. And so I was just thinking about throwing out a few other ideas. Namely, I was thinking, um, like I've been thinking about the kind of like this kind of democratic tenet that you'll see in art museums that like all art is democratic, all art should be for everyone. And there are kind of like a number of like loosely, I don't even want to say like leftist, but like liberal kind of like ideas that kind of like are meant to inform our understanding of like all art. And I don't know, I've just been thinking about how like there seems to be some sort of basic disagreement or incompatibility between the idea that like all art is good and all art is valid because all art should be kind of like manifesting or not manifesting, should exemplify these kind of effectively like leftist or liberatory values or whatever. And the idea that like some art is actually just better than others. There's
Yeah.
some artworks are better than others or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is exactly what Malik is so good about is that he has these two, there's what does he call the anarcho realist maxim, which is sort of this idea that artists want the world to be better. They want, a utopia, a sort of a more just, a more idealized society on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we have this sort of what I can't remember exactly what he calls it, but it's this sort of like um, sort of contemporaneity mode of sort of like you have to affirm everything. Like everything is, a valid exploration of the world. So like we need to sort of embrace a sort of yeah, the sort of like liberal sort of idealism of like sort of broad inclusivity. And I think the two terms sort of what Malik sort of is great at nailing down is that you have this utopianism that sort of, yearning to go higher, and then a sort of breadth that refuses to sort of narrow its scope into a specific idea that agrees to judge that something is more successful or less successful than something else, and there's um, a desire to progress through the anarcho realist maxim, this idea of like a just greater harmonious world, and then sort of like trying to make that harmony real in the present by refusing to say anything is bad, which actually forecloses the possibility of making progress in any direction. And so that's what I think Malik nails down is precisely that tendency in contemporary art to refuse to distinguish and therefore to refuse to make progress in any direction. Um, and I think so that I think, and this just like is something I had in my notes that I looked over, is that you can kind of see, I think, the ground of it, not in Sakula himself, because I think he's a very, subtle thinker, but there's a sort of in being like, I'm a, you know, hardline Marxist, I reject modernism, and like I only want this sort of political project to go forward. Um, there's a sort of underlying logic to the critique, which is that like modernism and the history of art is all like bourgeois, and we should just like throw that out, and we should just do our political project, and our political project is going to like work. And I think the sort of glib critique I have of this sort of a very wide swath of kind of like almost everyone in sort of the October journal scene is this sort of, there's a presumption at the root of almost every current in this, what could broadly be called like postmodern, post 60s art, is that like, okay, we're critiquing this thing, uh judgment in art, historical art, etc. And because we're critiquing it, now it's gone. Like we critiqued, like the history of art, that's bourgeois. Forget about it. And I think the problem is a critique of a thing does not throw it out the window. It's a critique of it. The thing is still there. Like, and I think this is sort of the presumptuous basis of a lot of art now is like, or even just culture in general, is it's sort of like this notion of like, um, whatever, like, I don't want to start sounding like conservative or something about it. Like, I think a lot of like the sort of basis of sort of social critique of, whatever, like gender binary and stuff is like, you're like, I reject, heteropatriarchy, therefore we're doing something different. I think it's good to critique heteropatriarchy. I think these things are just complex, and that you know easier way to put it is that there's this sort of the rejection of the world following the 60s is sort of this idea that we reject this thing and now we're going to have a better world, and having a better world is something that's extremely difficult, and just a very complex, like, growing situation that sort of develops empirically and doesn't follow your assumptions and is just messy and complicated, and and just these, I think my only point is that I think presuming that these sort of a radical critique of anything, um, that it automatically sort of resolves the problem of the thing you're critiquing is sort of a form of hubris. That you can't remove yourself from the conditions of the world by recognizing that they're unjust, even though they are. Sort of whatever liberatory thought or practices are extremely complex, and I think more complex than people were willing to admit or even aware of in the 60s and 70s, and that I think to take that thought from those eras and integrate them now, I think you need to grapple with the fraught difficulty of those conditions as a starting point to make use of any of the insights that are there to be made. Kyle.
Hi. Hopefully what I'm about to say will sort of be similar or sort of resonate with the things that Sean and Julian just said. Like going back to this idea of like judgment, Sean, that you used that specific word. I kind of like, in listening to everybody talk and doing these readings, I ended up thinking a lot about Marxism and psychoanalysis sort of as these two pillars of sort of critical theory in the 20th century into the 21st. And are these like actually adequate tools for judgment? They seem like very good tools or a very good place to go for acquiring like a vocabulary of analysis, but they still sort of like almost leave us in a sort of like, relativist position. Like jumping ahead a week in the readings, reading like Ben Davis's review of the Anne Imhoff. He's talking about Brecht's idea of immersion in like a theatrical performance that then sort of like you're pulled out of it and you're sort of alienated from it. And he ends up defending Anne Imhoff, saying she's kind of doing the opposite, where you sort of start feeling alienated through this like mediated thing on your phone, but then by the end you're sort of immersed in it. And in my reading, it's like, well, okay, so you're using this sort of Marxist language to do intelligent analysis, but I think you're saying that both Brecht and Imhoff are doing opposite things, but are both valid or good, maybe in a way. So it sort of leaves us in like a sort of relativist position. And like, the last year I've been reading like a lot of Marx and David Harvey and Althusser, Jameson, uh, Ben Davis, Anna Kornblue, and you know, even Anna Kornblue kind of like she does set out that she thinks there's sort of like problems with the sort of type of art that might reflect sort of like a mode of production or commodity circulation that's going on right now. But I don't know if I think her art criticism is necessarily very good when it gets down to like the specifics. And how are these tools of, you know, can you use these tools of analysis or psychoanalysis and Marxism to like make judgment of like abstract painting, and if you want to like, I don't know, talk about abstract painting and why you like it or not, do you have to revert to some like 19th or even 18th century like sort of model of connoisseurship where we're doing something like Diderot, or like somebody talking about like how so and so's paintings within the salon are more true because the brushstrokes, like, I don't know, are better and reflect a nature in a more pure way or something. And I don't know, I don't really have any answers to that, but yeah, I don't know. Those are
Yeah,
all
I think those are great points. I think, I think this is sort of like a great sort of, these sort of like key pillars, like you said, the Marxism and psychoanalysis as these sort of the building blocks that sort of this whatever post-structural, post-modern worldview were built on. And I think the constant danger of this in pretty much any like form of intellectual modeling is the idea that these things sort of contain the truth within them. And the you know materialist like radical empiricism position that I take, because my subject is art, if I cared about science or something, I'd have to change my point of view. But I think the thing is that you have these tools of Marxist thought, psychoanalytic thought, and they offer you avenues for thinking about things with great complexity. But the thing is that the thing still exists out there and is not encapsulated by your critique or your analysis of these things. And that, the problem of the sort of experience itself isn't reducible to these modes of inquiry. And, so, you mentioned Diderot, and I was just reading his criticism recently. And I kind of like, it's kind of hard to read because, I mean, it's interesting historically, like, just the fact that he was writing basically like a shopping catalog for the like royalty of Europe, who wasn't going to actually see the stuff. So he was really kind of like writing, very elevated like product descriptions, but it's like hard to read them without reproductions, and it's not a great era of painting either. But but I think what sort of comes through as sort of like a integral value to art writing that Diderot achieves is that he's simply like witty and enjoyable to read, and there's a certain value of expressiveness in his own subjectivity and his own sort of like I agree that that sort of truthfulness of brushstrokes is of course a very like trite reactionary position if someone was to take it now, but those were the terms that he worked under, but there's a certain exposure of like Diderot's own sensibility that's something that comes through in his own writing, and I think that's something that I've always valued in criticism is not so much a sort of like a truthfulness or like a exhaustibility of analysis, but rather that um, the person writing is someone who has a sort of engagement with their subject on some level, and that they're uh, transmitting it to you, and that the process of that transmission is at least entertaining or insightful or colors your own engagement with the thing. But yeah, Karis, is that how you say it?
Yes, Haris. I wanted to ask, what do you consider as art?
Mm. Well, so I think this is that's a good question actually, because I think that's something that comes up in the Malik, because in it he talks about Thierry de Duve and Kant after Duchamp, and what de Duve tries to do is change Kantian terms of judgment from is this beautiful or is this beautiful art or whatever as the terms of judgment of art to is this art, and that his mechanism he's trying to put in place is that the judgment of art is the acceptance of something achieving the terms of art, um and like being like, okay, well, I consider this thing in this room art, like I consider Duchamp's urinal art, so it's art. And so he tries to make that adequate terms for defining art in general. And I don't think that's adequate at all. I've never really been interested in the distinction between like a painting that is art and a painting that isn't art. I think and I think this is actually sort of like a, at least the way I read it, you know, going back to how I was thinking about art when I first watched his videos. I was those were kind of the days when like all the artists I knew were like really into using Instagram and sort of like taking pictures of like the stupidest thing they'd ever seen and posting it on Instagram, and that there was a sort of um uh a network, sort of like networked edifice of sort of Instagram as a medium of making any sort of experience in life art, like whatever, trash on the ground, posting it and it being like, wow, that person really took the worst picture possible, like that's a great Instagram post. And so my point with that, I think that um undoes sort of de Duve's terms of there being like standardized sort of conventional, or not even standardized or conventional, but like a art non-art distinction. I think I'm pretty much of I think that experience of that era, sort of like the post Tumblr, like everyone sort of trying to aestheticize everything in the world. Um, like going through that era, I came to the conclusion that you can pretty much say everything is art, like, you know, as long as it's being argued that way, or like you can even like perceive any everyday experience as essentially, you know, equitable to what art presents itself to be. Um, the question is if it's good or bad art. So in that, I think that's sort of the jump I've made that, you know, I didn't even know it at the time, but I think it's a sort of, I didn't know that that was sort of a radical leap away from sort of what arts discourse had been for, you know, 50 years when I thought of it that way. But it's sort of the grounds I've been thinking of ever since is you know, is that these sort of categorical distinctions aren't particularly important for the judgment of art. It's rather a something to be navigated like purely qualitatively. I think there's a line I like from Adorno's aesthetic theory where he says art is about saying nothing eloquently. And I think that's a penetrating line in the sense that I think you can judge someone with a enough exposure and sort of knowledge of art in general. You can develop a sensibility that allows you to judge whether or not the artist or the artwork you're faced with, if that has a quality of a sort of eloquence to it or not. I mean, I think, you know, I always think of a sort of example of like as a sort of like baseline of sort of what judgment is, as something foundational. And this sounds very kind of traditionalist, but I think I'm just like trying to think of it as a sort of pre-modern, in the sense of like a foundational phenomenon, which is like you take this idea of like a village where, you know, there's like a festival or something, and the people at the festival are like, the young people are dancing, and like the older people are watching the younger people dancing, and you like the older people who have experience, they've, you know, lived their whole lives in the village, they know the dances, they can look around and they can see, you know, which of the young people are, you know, the best dancers or something. They have like a flair for it, or, you know, whatever, a certain enjoyment. Like I think that there's something, and that, you know, that recognition is something that you can't, that I personally don't think is something you can excise from even the most rarefied form of art. Like I think, you know, these terms of like engagement in one's own art, or sort of attentiveness, or you know, focus or something, like these sort of qualitative baselines of a person living their life, like sort of just distracted versus sort of focused, those lines are sort of a basis for something to the core of art that you can't definitively throw out, even at its most rarefied. And I think so that, to me, I think that's sort of my thesis about sort of artistic judgment, is that regarding like objects, there are not terms for how one can, you know, judge definitively what the art is, whether it's, you know, beautiful, or, you know, an engaging abstract painting or whatever. Like I don't think there are baseline terms for that, but I do think that you can sort of look at artworks as the output of an artist, and that it's possible to discern whether the artist themselves is deeply invested or engaged with their own work, or if they're just sort of like going through the motions, or if like they don't really know what they're doing, etc. So I think that's sort of my, I haven't really, that's kind of a grandiose claim in relation to sort of all the rhetoric surrounding art history, but I haven't really fleshed it out. But that's sort of my suspicion, I guess.
I follow you. My
Mhm.
question was mostly whether we need the uh, if we still need for something to be considered as art, just to be exhibited or claimed as art by an artist, whatever entity the artist may be.
Mhm.
Do we still need that? I was mostly curious of whether we have shifted from that or whether there's some wider range of understanding of art. That was mostly my question. If we still
What
need
would
artists or if we are in this context of this class, if we could or accept something claimed as art just by the author of the text that is criticizing the art? Or do we still need to be able to criticize something as art, someone else, some other entity, the artist, to be there, to justify our criticism?
I I guess I'm not entirely sure what you're thinking of as sort of the alternative to, like, what the outside position of like there is the art world, art criticism sphere, but what is the sort of alternative that you're positing, that just like there's a, if we can kind of talk about all of life as if it's art, or
Yes, I'm trying to understand the distinction. I don't
Mhm.
suppose anything. I don't, it's not like I have an idea that I'm like, should we go there? I'm just
Mhm.
asking.
Yeah, I think there's I think there's an argument to be made that uh the distinction, I think, is maybe weaker than was historically supposed. I think kind of um the line is pretty porous in my mind, but I do think that just in terms of it being a um like art and the art world being a sort of contingent context in which people learn to think about and approach art in general, it's there's substance to it that distinguishes it from everything else, but I think that that's um more of, a sort of convention, or like a sort of basis of chance, than it is sort of like a like categorical difference between art and everything else. Lynn, or oh, yeah, wow, try to keep it diversified.
I what I have not watched the whole lectures of Exit Not Escape, but I read the summarizing text,
Mm-hmm.
and because I have a problem with just listening stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that there was like he argues that there is this idea that of anarcho-realism in which like you can only be cynical in the art world. And he starts the lectures talking about indeterminacy. And then he says that indeterminacy enables benevolence and abuse. There's like a secret power in indeterminacy. And what I caught myself thinking was that he was talking at like he was talking both about the indeterminacy of the artistic practice, but also on the metaphorical level about the kind of forms that contemporary art has today. I do not know if this is like, but there's like this interplay, and I feel like these are two very different things. What came to my mind is that there should be ways of doing like art that like Danto describes today, like there's not really a style that unifies everything. There it is more like an exploration of different aspects of it, without it being like um, understood as cynical, just because there is like this exploration in form. I do not know. I feel like there was this ambiguity. Um, I hope I'm not misinterpreting anything really heavily, but what came to my mind is that there should be a way of talking of not equating both things.
Yeah, well, I think you're exactly right. He's not equating the two. I think he's sort of saying that the two uh have an interplay, and I think that the two, as they interact, is what creates the sort of static, cynical problem of the art world. So what he's exactly trying to address is how to disconnect the two and find a way out of that cynicism into a more principled approach to the arts in general, I think. Lynn?
I'm curious to hear more about your criteria concerning good and bad art, because this is something which I'm thinking about a lot. I mean, I don't necessarily use the words good and bad art, but I am very much concerned with how, in general, to think about work of my colleagues, for instance. And for me, the biggest problem is that like the good art would sort of escape any criteria which I could have prior to viewing it rationally, because the quality of art which for me is of most value is exactly of turning around this apparatus of understanding that one might have prior to it, and therefore it's really difficult to somehow make a logical scheme of what we are looking for exactly. So I would be curious to hear your.
So I think the sort of important basis for sort of this ground of what I kind of suggested as sort of trying to judge artists as subjects and their artworks as sort of a trace of their output or whatever. The grounding for it that I think is really crucial is that art itself is uh, a field, with its own sets of rules and its own conventions and its own sort of signifiers and ins and outs and whatever. And I think so that's you can refer to it as sort of like the cultural content of art, that it's sort of grounded in these social terms, or like these ideas of like just like on some level, like I mean there's a few levels you can put it on. One is that I think there's a sort of moral content to art, in the sense that a artist's output is sort of a reproduction of their own sort of comprehension of the world, on some level, and that it's sort of like an exposure of sort of their values and worldview just by fact of what they've decided to do, like implicates something about who they are, like, which doesn't necessarily, is not to say that like good artists are moral people. They're very often not, but there's a sort of interplay of the sort of like subjects sort of like knowledge and understanding of sort of the world that led them to develop their practice as it is. And then the other side is sort of like I was just talking to a friend recently, and we were looking at some paintings, and we were like, yeah, it's like kind of good, it's okay. And then she just said like, yeah, well, they just don't have swag, they don't, they like, it's just like a certain thing of like, and this is what I meant sort of about the like village dance example or whatever, is it's just like some people know how to dress themselves in a way that like, signals to other people, like having style, having a sensibility, and having a refined sensibility that is expansive for the artist in terms of their own work. Like that would be, you can make a distinction between an artist who, knows how to make work without sort of falling into like lazy repetition, doing it for like 50 years and like, re-entering the work and revitalizing their own relationship to it. And that, that the work for the artist seems to be inexhaustible to them is, I think, a really important sort of qualitative signifier for art, which of course is, not a useful term when, you're, trying to judge your peers, because, none of you have had 50-year careers. But I think that the sort of that, there's like a good Gertrude Stein quote. Like, I think she did a talk about painting, and she says, painting is one of the hardest things there is, because, anyone can make one painting, but the problem with being a painter is that then you have to make another painting, and you already did a painting. So like, how are you going to stay interested in making a second painting? And that, I think, is kind of what I'm getting at, is that, being an artist in the sense of like going to your studio every day and like working on this thing, there's ultimately a question of like, when you're by yourself working on what you're doing, is that like, are you engaged with that? Are you fulfilled by that? Is that a productive process? And is it, and not only to yourself, but also does it integrate into sort of the social context of art as well? Is it, which is like, I think that there's sort of just like cultural capital and like coolness and stuff, like those terms become important, because it's sort of, especially like in New York or something, like there's certain artists who know how to do something that other people are excited to see, that signifies something to other people, where it's sort of like, oh, this isn't the 50,000th abstract painting I've seen. Like, this person is doing something different. And that sort of, in New York, if not many other places these days, like that sort of there being a social cohort of people who are thinking about these things and like considering them, and that like that there's these people who know sort of the lay of the land of the contemporary art world, and can determine within that context that something is a success or a failure. Like having those, like being in that context where sort of like you're vulnerable to being seen or judged or whatever, is creates a sense of stakes that makes art something that can succeed or fail. Because I don't think that art succeeds or fails on its own terms in a vacuum. I think it only succeeds or fails within a sort of specific cultural context. So I don't know if that's clarifying. Costanza?
Yes.
Constanza, yeah.
Oh, you got it. So I have to keep my camera off because my internet is unstable. But okay, I don't want to bring up too much the earlier discussion around, the internet and art, but that did bring something to my mind that I would like to say, but also clarify also for the context of this course, which is and for context also, I am a visual artist. I've also worked in like commercial galleries. And I've realized that at the end of the day, visibility matters so much because you could have technically incredible artists, let's say, that makes great, I don't know, that has a great way to blend their art with politics. Of course, what politics and do you agree with the politics? That's a different question. But let's say that, it's their mission to bring, I don't know, awareness into something. But if they have no visibility, it stays in their studio, right? It doesn't live anywhere else. But the second one is the internet was brought up. And yes, they can go viral. They could go viral on TikTok. They could go viral on Instagram. But even then, I don't know. I lived and worked in a community in Canada that was very much known for its art and had so many galleries. Like on Main Street, we had food and galleries, art galleries, big time art collectors. But the art was all the same. You could not tell one artist from the other. They all painted trees in Canada. Very beautiful, very technically incredible, but very boring. And it's actually one of the reasons that I'm in this course because I got so sick and tired of this. So then there was an earlier discussion about institution, but I cannot say that that belongs to one institution. There is not one entity, let's say in that city or that town saying, oh no, this art belongs here or it doesn't. It's so intricate and invisible. But so what institution, like if you were to critique an institution, what institution, like you could critique public art institutions, I guess, but how could you critique private, like literally one of the ladies that was the owner of one of the galleries I work for, she was like almost retired. She had a bit of money and she just decided to do this collection on her own. Like she wasn't connected to anything else. It's very hard to criticize, but it's still, I think, whatever's in person, whatever is on the street is more powerful, even in the age of technology, I would say, than anything we can do in any other medium. It's still where we live, right? So I don't know. That was like, but for the context of this course, I wanted to clarify, like, are we talking about again that artist with no visibility? Because what do we gain even from critiquing that? Or if it's institution, what are those parameters?
Yeah, so I think the first point that I think the talking about sort of this weird little art scene thing reminds me of just sort of that I remember I would talk with someone who like lived in kind of like middle of nowhere California and like looked at art in New York a lot on Instagram. And I remember him like asking me a few times, like, well, what's the point of like moving to New York? Like, why do you have to go to New York? Like, can't you just like see what's happening on Instagram? And like, isn't that enough to just like know and keep your, eyes on the New York art scene? And I was just like, no, I don't think that that's adequate. I don't think that seeing a sort of social world mediated through Instagram is actually an accurate picture of what the thing is. And I think like contemporary art is a big sort of like world with like its own sort of like avenues and many flaws, but like it I fundamentally don't really believe in sort of the notion that these sort of great artists sort of like come out of nowhere. I think, you know, great artists are people that sort of were fostered by a sort of like social frame, which is, I think, to go to the institution question, I think the way Malik is talking about institutions is very much within sort of the framework, not just a sort of random collection, but just that these people within the art world who know the conditions and terms of the art world want to change the terms of the art world and seek to go about doing that by setting up a sort of organization that's pushing in the direction they want to go. And, you know, and I think the thing is, like, that's part of the reason I kind of liked his conclusions more when I watched it this time, is because it's sort of like, well, like my own website, the Manhattan Art Review, is in that sense an institution. It is a thing that I've been doing for years that has, you know, in whatever small way, adjusted sort of the popular terms of discourse around art, and that change is sort of the goal he has in mind. And like, obviously I'm biased in its favor because I can associate myself with it, but like, I do think that that's, I don't know what other changes there are to make, you know, in you know, like whatever, like this isn't, you know, a like, you know, what do they call it? Like a, you know, like a Soviet, like organized society where they're gonna like make changes from the top down. Like we're stuck kind of with the system that we have. And so I think in that sense, institutions are like forces that can sort of precipitate change in whatever little sort of incremental ways. But I think the thing too about, and I kind of tried to touch on this in talking about sort of the like, you know, 60s critical deconstructive mindset that sort of, you know, people want to change these systems or like break from tradition, and that those breaks do not sort of like automatically create a sort of alternative world that's better. Like, you know, you can't exit society and have a new sort of utopia ready-made. Like these things have to be built from the ground up, and it's extremely difficult. And I'm not entirely convinced that it's possible to do so outside of the normative system that you're rejecting. But a good example of that is sort of the a big problem with a lot of sort of critical deconstructive approaches to the art world, this sort of like I don't know, just rejection of sort of these normative positions, is that they don't, you know, create new institutions. Or here's a good way to frame it, is that, you know, you take whatever, like music composition or something, and, you know, people used to learn it traditionally, and then like Schoenberg comes along, and then you get like John Cage and Morton Feldman, you know, these people sort of who reject the sort of traditional structures of Western classical composition, but were taught it. They proliferate into their own sort of approaches, like, you know, John Cage and Morton Feldman and Alvin Lucier and Robert Ashley, you know, they all do their own different things. And the problem to me comes with the fact that all those people who sort of rejected the sort of edifice that they were given didn't leave behind their own edifices. Morton Feldman did not leave behind a school of Morton Feldman composition. Like, people don't know how to write compositions like Morton Feldman did it. He's the only guy who knew how to do it. And I think that there's a sort of loss in the removal of the structure, just in very practical terms of sort of like, you know, like what do people learn in art school now? They don't learn figurative painting. Like, I'm not saying people should learn figurative painting, but at least learning figurative painting is something to work on. The problem is that the contemporary art, like, educational system doesn't have anything to teach you because, you know, there's no rules of how to make. So the only thing they're teaching you is how to market yourself. And so that's the problem, is this sort of proliferation of everything into these sort of, you know, diversified non-denominational modes, doesn't lead to, you know, anti-capitalist utopianism. It leads precisely to a redoubled, more focused capitalism and commodification of the art world. And that sort of, you know, if I have like a traditionalist bone in me, it's that I think that through sort of like knowing how to work on what you're doing, sort of having a personal connection to what you do that isn't motivated by the market, is sort of like the grounds that good art arises from. And that I think you need, you know, not craft necessarily, but you need a baseline. You need terms for engaging yourself with your own work. And like, and you know, I'm kind of like going far afield at this point, but I think, you know, like, the problem, I've written about this a while ago, but I think the problem that Duchamp creates is, you know, not anything about, you know, the crisis of the art object or the ready-made. Is that it creates the norm that you can be an artist who doesn't make anything. And the only reason that's a problem is if you're an artist who doesn't make anything, what do you do when you go to your studio? I mean, I'm not saying, you know, obviously there are artists who don't make anything. Well, yeah, reading, that's the thing, is like, sure, reading can be something that, you know, whatever, like Michael Asher, great artist, you know, didn't, you know, they just had a show of his at Artist Space, and, you know, it was only like pamphlets and ephemera because everything he did was site specific. What's this? I've been ignoring the chat because it's too disorienting to look at it, but this one caught me. If art can be anything and its quality is swag, how does one go about teaching it? Do you teach, for instance, the attitude to adopt towards one's work, e.g. terms of engagement with one's work? Well, so this is a good question, is because I think the fundamental problem of art teaching has always been like, how do you, well, the crisis of art, it's not a crisis, but the problem of teaching art is, can you teach art? Like, can you teach someone to be a genius? Can you teach someone to be a great artist? I'm not convinced that you can, but I do think that there's sort of conditions of fostering people who, you know, like there's a certain indeterminacy of the specificity of who each person is in their own, you know, proclivities and potentialities, that those quantities of who a person is are, you know, conditioned by the world around them, or, you know, their upbringing, whatever. It's a lot of, or, you know, their genetics, I don't know. And if you come to art school with those things, like, the question is, like, does the school help you foster those qualities you have into someone who becomes good at making art? And I think this is sort of this serious institutional problem of contemporary art now, is, you know, I think like I think, there's definitely a value in sort of learning from example of like a successful artist who's not sort of crassly commercial, that you can pursue things like for its own ends and not for the market. But I don't think the contemporary art world really has an ability to instill people with, a sense of non-capitalist values. Like I think one of the strengths that I had going into getting into art, like I didn't really know about contemporary art till I was like 25 or so, but I had been into like experimental music, and all my heroes, like, whatever, they'd come out with a record every couple of years and it would be like a run of 500 LPs. Like they weren't making their living on their music. They were like my heroes or whatever. They weren't successful. So like there was a certain like grounds of sort of authenticity or sort of like uh self-perpetuating drive to do what they do because they want it. That I took as a sort of basis that when you come to the art world is not at all something that's safe to presume, because everyone wants to be Jasper Johns, succeed out of the gate with your first show, sell to the Whitney within like 5 years and then just clean up for the rest of your life and be a beloved artist whose like credentials are unimpeachable. There's a sort of, success and popularity, success and like credibility thing that you have with the art world that I was fortunate to not have as my basis, when I was in college. And I think a sort of anti-establishment attitude that I don't think I think the art world is very good at smothering a sort of anti-establishment attitude at this point. Which is interesting when you look at, artists like Sakula or something, where there was at that time a, radical contingent in art, in a political or otherwise sphere, and that, but that's also like the National Endowment for the Arts existed in the 70s and gave money to people like Sakula and Michael Asher. And now you don't have those things. And so that's sort of, this is where this basis of this problem comes in for me, is like, I agree that these artists from this era were radical and pushing art forward in ways that we should consider. But considering how shitty the art world is now, like, what do you do with these examples? And it's difficult. Julian.
So yeah, I have like 3 little thoughts that I should like put out there. The first thought, I agree with like all of the, I'm gonna go in like reverse chronological order. So like the one potential thought to kind of complicate your critique of the market, which I completely agree, like Smother's work and like overwhelmingly champions just like horrific work. Why then is it? Because I feel like I tend to have like a very similar point of view. I hate almost everything I see. Like I'm very cynical, whatever. And yet, many of my favorite artists, who I think are actually amazing, are also successful within the and have representation. And like there are these kind of like breaks from the kind of like reasonless market logic of like success and like the upward spiral of success for an artist who like isn't doing anything interesting, which like kind of like throw me off. And it's kind of what threw me off of the like in the first few years when I was kind of like getting a sense of what was going on. It was really surprising because many of the folks who I thought were really good actually really were succeeding, not really realizing that proportionately they're kind of in the overwhelming minority. of those that kind of succeed, whatever. So that was the first thing I was thinking of. The second thing was at one point you were mentioning, you were thinking about or talking about the kind of like legacy of not just the October folks, but like it was the critique you made of the October folks that like in critiquing something that like therefore now the alternative exists or something like that. And I totally agree. I think that's really smart, interesting. I think there's also a funny thing that I've been thinking about because I watched an interview with Hal Foster where he was basically talking about how academia was probably like of all the cultural spheres, like in the United States, academia was the most receptive and the most kind of successfully transformed by the October theoretical project.
Yep.
And I think that's just really, I think that's kind of fascinating. And like the fact that like the reason why Foucault is like so widely read within the United States and within humanities departments everywhere is because of not the work that was championed by the October Journal folks, but like the criticism itself as a project about like recentering, not recentering, but like bringing in French philosophy, whatever. So I don't know. I just think that was another little thought that was kind of that I've just been kind of like sitting with. And then the
Yeah, I'll just jump in to get that one out of the way. But I do think just a kind of an aside is that there's a funny sort of rhetorical position with all that where sort of the October people were so addicted to their ivory tower, like you know, if you curated a show, like you were sort of really like dragging your own name through the mud and everyone was going to kind of like look down their nose at you for like participating in anything. And I think, you know, and I think it's sort of like the same problem in a different way, just that, you know, American academia, for whatever reason, during those decades was amenable to employing those people and giving them careers, and they were happy to take them. But you know that I think that I think that energy is petered out. Obviously, that Foucault is not going to be read in humanities programs for much longer, and which I don't think is a good thing. I think it's a bad thing. But I think I think there's plenty of critique to be levied at sort of their it's not even that I would critique them for being privileged. It's that there's a sort of a maybe comfort or a blindness that comes from sort of the like I think that there's a certain level of compromise involved in sort of existing within that academic world that they worked in, but that that they were maybe blind to it because it was enabling what they were doing. And I mean, obviously I think it would be better if we had a new generation of dedicated academics doing that sort of stuff now, because I don't really see it. Anyway, but what was your third?
Yeah, that's all interesting. And I actually wasn't even thinking about I wasn't even thinking about like what it would be like to like see that again, because I also just like haven't even thought of that as like a possibility or something.
Right.
And it was also like a so of that moment too. I know.
Yeah.
But the third thing was okay, so like I also at one point someone asked about like what are the metrics effectively, or like what's the logic that you use to kind of determine if something is good or bad or that sort of thing. And I stumbled across this thing in a talk by David Sally. And I also think of things in terms of like better or worse. I have for like ever, kind of, it feels like. And David Sally described this anecdote by Henry Geldzahler. Henry Geldzahler was the kind of curator of, I believe, contemporary art at the Met, a 20th century American curator, very, very important. And he did this show called, it was like New American Painting, I think. It was like the one that kind of like introduced abstract expressionism to an international institutional audience.
Mhm.
And what David said was he said, you know, this is David recounting Henry Geldzahler, like something that Henry Geldzahler said, where when Henry was a young boy, and I love this, it's been burned into my mind forever. When Henry was a young boy, or like a teenager or something like that, like him and his friends would go to the flea market and they'd look for a vase they liked, and they'd find a vase and they'd buy it and they'd kind of like live with the vase for a while. And then eventually they'd kind of get bored of it, you know, like after kind of like seeing it in their living room. And so like Henry and his friends would like go, they'd like find a new vase and they'd kind of like look through this stuff at the flea market. And then they'd like live with that new vase for a while. And then they get bored of that one and kind of like, this kind of just went on and on for like months or years. And then gradually, eventually, like Henry kind of developed an eye effectively. I think this is how David Sally described it. Henry developed an eye like for vases, and he kind of learned to distinguish between the vases that were kind of like good or interesting or unexpected or whatever, and the vases that weren't. And so David Sally kind of like uses this as like the way that David then frames it is like, this is kind of analogous to how the development of good taste works in contemporary art, basically, where like, the more you are just kind of exposed to stuff, the more you kind of experience things, the more stuff that you look at, the more you kind of naturally understand, like, quote unquote, what makes good vase, you know? And I don't know, that's just like, I've just thought about that forever, because that is like, that's the only, I've never heard of any position from any figure in the art, in the art world, living or dead, who can kind of like crystallize that learning process or something. And so that's what that, yeah, I just wanted to share that.
Yeah. No, I agree totally. And that's sort of the comparison I always sort of like turn to is like you can see my liquor shelf over there. Like I used to work at a whiskey shop for a long time, and I like expensive, like fancy or, you know, craft spirits or whatever. And the thing is that, you know, you can't give a whatever the best scotch in the world to a person who knows nothing, who's only ever, you know, drank Jack Daniels. If they give it a sip, they'll be like, oh, it's smooth. Oh, okay. I don't know. It's nice. And, you know, just none of it, it doesn't register to them at all whatsoever. And that's sort of, you know, the easy metaphor for like tourists going to MoMA and being like, I don't know what all this weird stuff is. Like that art is a field with a sphere of expertise and a sphere of, you know, knowledge and exposure, and that you develop a relationship to this stuff as you are exposed to it and develop a relationship with it. And like I think that's sort of the a central problem I have sort of with the like Kantian like notion of like art as a, you know, art should be beautiful and beauty is some sort of like universal that is kind of like culturally agreed upon. I don't think that's true at all. I think that, you know, great experiences with art are like, you know, only enabled by the sort of, you know, contingent sphere of a person's relationship to art that already exists. Like you can't walk around, you know, without any background, like, and expect that to like result in some like life-changing experience. I mean, you know, it's just stuff like, that's why I like art really in the first place, is that I can, you know, for the rest of my life, I expect to continue to be exposed to art and artists that I didn't have a, you know, positive feeling towards or like didn't know about, and then I can like learn about them and deepen and, you know, develop a relationship with that artist. Like, you know, I like a year and a half ago I didn't really like Manet that much, and then I read a bunch of books on him, and now I think Manet is fantastic. Like, you know, it's I think there's a I think that's a big problem, and I think it's a big problem that's at the root of a lot of the misconceptions of this sort of postmodern thought that we're trying to deal with, is that there's a notion that like art is subjective, that like your subjectivity is sort of like granted and pre-existent, and that like how you feel about art is automatically valid, which is, I think, part of what Malik was contrasting with, is that sort of like liberalized sort of acceptance of anything, that any position is valid. But I think that's just factually incorrect, that like a love of art is something that's fostered and developed through experience and exposure, and like broadening one's horizons of what is considered good and bad, rather than sort of assuming that like the things you like at 16 are what you should like for the rest of your life. Like these things, this sort of that an engagement with art is one that's ongoing and constantly developing, and that to me is sort of one of the great qualities of art, is that you have that space for sort of development. What was your first question, though? That cold brew I was having got on top of me. I can't think straight.
The first thing that I don't really remember.
Okay. Oh well, I thought I had something to say, but whatever. We both lost it.
Yeah, the second thing was about October.
Right.
About David Sally thing. And the first, I have no idea. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Sarah?
Hi. Something just popped into my head too about is there possibly a correlation between how, as art became so much weirder in the 20th century and even into the 19th century, and reproduction became a lot easier. There wasn't a need for people to write about what art looked like anymore. So this kind of idea of writing about art in, say, a Renaissance painting, you didn't really have to do that anymore with iconography and whatnot. And so as art became way more weirder in the 20th century, people had to explain what it meant. And I guess this popped into my head when you were talking about MoMA and tourists walking through and being like, I don't get this, whatever. So as people were writing about the meaning of art and why this dot on a blank canvas means something, it became easier to kind of just make it all about meaning and make it all about what is it and why was it made and who is the artist and what is their life story, rather than critiquing it and saying it's good or bad. And I'm not entirely sure where I'm going with this, but it just that, I guess it's you sort of lost argument in the process when you're just explaining why something is the way it is. You're just, argument goes out the window, and it's like, how could you argue with this? This is why it was made. And the binaries are no longer there.
Yeah, I think the basis of that is really just sort of comes out of modernism as sort of this the starting point of these sort of rejections of tradition that word framing in the later half of the 20th century, but really started in the 19th century, and that these sort of whatever salon de refuses, like the academy used to like dictate artistic quality, and then like Manet and the Impressionists come in and they start challenging those grounds, and there's a sort of maybe like avant-garde notion of sort of that art is sort of always rejecting this past condition and sort of pushing into a new direction, and that that forward steps on the treadmill is sort of where artistic value comes in, because it's sort of directly engaged with this sort of like historical procedure. And I think yeah, and I think that sort of live historicizing process of sort of reaching the new thing, or sort of the subversion of the subversion of the sort of critique and etc. The sort of it's like a sort of game of avoiding a sort of normativity that sort of gets more and more complex as the 19th 20th century goes into the 20th, into the 21st. And and I think it reaches a sort of endpoint where a friend of mine said to me recently, like he's like, I think the reason your criticism is radical is really just because you weren't repeating the press release. And that's what everyone thought criticism was for a good couple decades, was just like you weren't really allowed to sort of impose thoughts about art like outside of what it was dictating itself to be. And the idea that you can reintegrate what you as a viewer think about it, independent of what the artist or the press release is saying, was a kind of a new position. But so I think that there's sort of a conflation of sort of the terms of development that were happening throughout the 20th century, where sort of you take like the October scene, and I think these people were sort of historicizing artists that sometimes they were just their friends. Like I think Buchloh gets a lot of flack for writing about people he likes and shitting on the ones he doesn't like, or like people he's not friends with. And like not that I'm reducing it to that, but like there's a sort of like value in art became this sort of political, critical, analytic significance rather than a sort of basis of judgment of art. And that I think that did work for people for a while. I think obviously I have reservations about it now, but I think it at the time, I think it was exciting for people. It was a means of thinking about art, like in the same way that we were talking about the pillars of Marxism and psychoanalysis, like analysis. These modes of thought were useful towards addressing their ends, but they don't necessarily get down to the fact of the matter, which is which I should also like put in as an aside, is that judgment isn't also getting to the end of the matter either. Like, because I'm not claiming that my own judgments are factually true. Like it's just a simply different mode of engaging with these things. But the core of, I think, this problem of sort of the exciting historical trajectory of art through the 20th century is that it was an arc of sort of increasing complexity and newness and critiques of critiques, etc. And now like that has dropped off. There are not new avant-gardes emerging. There are not people emerging with like clearly sort of critical, innovative modes that, for most of the 20th century, like someone in New York was doing something that you could credibly call like new. And I think it's harder to make that claim now than it has for a long time. And I think the problem is that I think a lot of this, the modernism coincides with modernity and like industry and the rise of capitalism, and that society itself was changing. Like this is like trite, but the 60s and the 90s were 30 years apart. The 90s and the 2020s are 30 years apart. Like society changed a lot more between the 60s and the 90s than it did in the last 30 years. And that's because like there was a sort of explosive progress in society throughout the 20th century. And I think, you know, the art world and art discourse and everything started to take that for granted as a sort of given motivating force, and didn't think that these ideas of sort of critique or judgment were really necessary anymore. But I think the you know, train has stopped barreling uphill or downhill, I don't know, as quickly as it used to. And so I think we're kind of left in this point of like reckoning with what we thought art did and how it worked and how people, you know, thought it was what people thought was, you know, the terms of how you could talk about art perpetually. Those, a lot of those terms have sort of stopped working as well as they used to, and so you're sort of left with a problem of where do you go from here? Costanza?
I think this came up a bit ago, but I'll try to thread it into our thing. So earlier you had mentioned that like in the current discourse, we should start to see even postmodernity has like historical, right? At this point. But what does that actually mean? Like in because I don't know if it connects, but the next thing that was mentioned at one point was its idea that, you know, when you critique something, the thing you're critiquing doesn't go away, right? Critique doesn't make things disappear. Like I could critique, for example, those galleries that only had very nice, super realistic trees, and I can write about it. I can do whatever. I can do a press conference if I wish, and it's still gonna be there.
Yeah.
But that made me think, is there something unifying art critiques in contemporary time? Or is it just this thing that's always, because then, okay, I don't know, this is like a hard thought, because let's say that a critique eventually changed the way a commercial gallery functions, and suddenly they included lots of different artworks, and it's very varied and very different. Then the critique is dead. So you know what I mean? Like, the critique doesn't kill what you're critiquing, but if what you're critiquing changes, it kills your critique. Unless then you go and you say, oh, wait, now it's too chaotic. Let's bring it back to those trees. And then you're just always just going against the grain, sort of like has a fundamental act of just for the sake of that. Or is there something else behind that that's like stable? I don't know if that makes.
Yeah, no, I think, well, so there's a couple things is I think on some level there's you're conflating a bit the social criticality of postmodern art and then art criticism. And I think those are two different things. And I think, yeah, I think what you were saying about like yeah, a art critic doesn't stop critiquing. You know, that's I think that yeah, you don't ever reach a sort of endpoint of like, oh, now art is good and I can retire. Like that doesn't, I don't think that's ever going to happen. But I think the thing that I'm trying to like raise is that exactly that, which is the historicizing postmodernism means looking back at that critical content of art from the 60s and 70s and saying, okay, well, those critiques maybe didn't work out the way they thought, but what can we learn from them now? What can they teach us about looking at art now? And where, you know, where did they go wrong? How does it clarify or like relate to the way we understand art in the present? And I, you know, it's always ongoing. I don't think, you know, the you know, even if you know, 100 mind-blowing, fantastic artists started, emerged out of nowhere and started dominating all the shows. I don't think, I don't think that would end criticism, because I don't think art criticism isn't necessarily a critique in the same way that critical art is. Like, critical art is sort of like critiquing the system, sort of wanting it to be different. And art criticism is more of like a document of the critic's understanding of art, and sort of a grappling with terms of the art that they're faced with, or the art world, or sort of trying to figure out what's happening in the present. And since the present's always fleeting, then like it's always going to be a set of terms that are always going to be changing.
So to clarify, it's okay, that makes sense. So it's not, so it is constantly changing, because so like Sekula, right, in his article, like I looked at the publication year was like 1978. And obviously like he's aligning with, socialist principles when saying like art in America is just so depoliticized. But then I was thinking that at the same time, in Cuba, for example, art was the opposite of depoliticized. It was extremely politicized to a point where, you could claim it had lost a lot of its, I don't know, it was almost propaganda at that point, right? So how would that, like if he himself had critiqued that, wouldn't that have countered his own critique? Am I thinking it's hard? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
I think those are real points. I mean, I think, there's a line to be drawn between sort of like radical political art that he wants from these sort of contemporary artists versus sort of a socialist realism that's sort of like dictated by the state. I think there's plenty, clearly, like, propaganda, like enforced propaganda is not very few people's ideal art form. And so the sort of, I think he would probably have strong reservations about sort of the political content of propaganda in Cuba, and like that wouldn't be meeting his ideals just because it's political. I think he has different, more complex political ideals. But I think, to me, I think the problem I have sort of with Sekula's position is um the difficulty of what this politics in art aims to do, like how it aims to change the world, if it's just art about people who like blue collar workers or something. Like is that praxis? Is that instituting social change? Is that really making the great differences that he aspires for? And that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, is like I have these reservations, and then I think, well, Sekula was a big influence on sort of exposing me to a lot of leftist thought that I still value. So like there's a practical value in that, obviously. I think my reservation is more the 70s position. There was a enthusiasm for a new left art that coincided with a political movement that has not come to pass socially. And so the sort of conviction undergirding what he wanted to support is, I think, pretty hard to defend. Like if you were going to make art now, like the sort of convictions he has, like I don't, there isn't like a clear, I don't know, like I have a hard time imagining, a contemporary artist being like, yeah, I'm gonna make this like leftist art because like I'm a DSA member or something. Like you know, which isn't even like, I don't know, like I just in terms of like the hubris of it, or the sort of, it's like quixotic or whatever, like it's self-defeating, you know, like does anyone really think, you know, the DSA is going to change the scope of American politics? Like, I don't. But you know, I'm kind of cynical too. So let's do Kyle.
Hey, I'm gonna sort of like affirm. I think you and Constanza were saying like very similar things, and I just kind of want to like affirm them because there is this sort of, talking about Marxism earlier, but also there was this sort of moment a couple years ago in the art world here that maybe is sort of waning now, where there was this sort of like, I think it was kind of like Trump 1.0, where there was certain strains of the art world where it was like, oh, art has to have a meaning, or it has to be part of a political project or something, or some part of some sort of resistance or something like that. And like, just thinking about that, like creating a necessity for art to be part of a political project actually feels like the way you would think about art under an authoritarian regime.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
which is kind of what Costanza was also saying.
Mhm.
And like moving beyond that sort of thinking about it, while still at the same time thinking about how we can use art to maybe create a better world, or something that's easier or more meaningful to live in, is, I think, like the idea of play, which is
Mm.
maybe kind of left behind. Like, how can you sort of like, how can people engage in meaningful play and use it as sort of like a sort of medium for people to come together and have conversations about the world and other things like this that we're doing here that kind of like make life worth living in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so yeah, I think we'll have to, I think, wrap it up after this. But so I think, you know, that exactly, the, you know, the sort of whatever what you're saying about play is like this that's, I think, what Malik is saying is the anarcho-realist maxim, is this sort of idea that art yearns for a better world. And I think all art always has, you know, Botticelli yearns for a better world, you know, like the a beautiful Renaissance painting, you know, creates a picture of a greater thing. Um, and I think that's sort of the interesting thing about Malik's criticism, is that he's saying that there was this sort of um, and exactly the sort of like anti-Trump art thing is like, well, you have to make political art because we need to make political change right now with our art. So I'm gonna do, you know, 100 paintings of Donald Trump making an ugly face. And like that's dumb, because it's not, no one cares. Donald Trump doesn't care. You know, it's not gonna stop him from doing anything. So but that's, I think, exactly the anarcho-realist maxim of sort of like, we need to institute change right now through exactly what this art is and does, is sort of, you know, getting ahead of the ball of sort of what art actually does, is like good art sort of instantiates a sort of idea of something better, but that is always just sort of like a fleeting glimpse or a sort of moment of, you know, engagement or pleasure or something. That's sort of the content of art, and it always has been. And I think that's sort of what's interesting about Malik's conclusions, is that he comes to this end point where he says, you know, like we're you know, you kind of come out of the like contemporary muck of like everything going on at the same time, but also trying to affirm the utopianism at the same time. Like, to get out of that, you have to return to a mode of judgment. And that judgment is saying like, well, is this artist, achieving a vision of something? Is the, form of play that they're engaging in, is that, an affirmation of life that, is whatever exciting to the human mind? Which, is a difficult thing to say because as I've said, is like art is a very, disciplined contingent medium where, you can't say affirmatively, without question that, an artist is definitively good, but the need to try to signify that, this artist is doing something is um I think it, it's getting out of sort of the presumption of art's like overweening value to just the sort of basic experiential value that like art enriches your life. Art makes you, if you like art, it's, something that, is better than going to your day job or whatever. Like that, that's what art should be. And the fact that it is better than your day job should suggest something about how life could be. And I think that, and then so that goes back all the way back to like the beginning with the Taylor, the Scorned by Muses guy saying like, oh, well, a world where art, we wouldn't need art. That's the idea that like, oh, well, what if real life was as enjoyable as reading a good book or watching a movie or something? And I think that's just a ridiculous claim. Like, because the point of art is like an exposure to the world that like is by definition outside of your own experience. It's a breadth of, it's like a whatever. Tolstoy is a window into the world Tolstoy lived in that is unknowable to us in our daily life. And that exposure to, the breadth of recorded human knowledge and experience is enriching in a way that I don't think our own lives can ever achieve. Maybe that's good.
Yeah, I have one more question just to end the set because you said you were gonna end the session. I just there were like writing assignments. How do you want us to how do we were we already supposed to turn one in? Are we turning one in?
No, I think you do it by the beginning of next session.
Okay, so there'll be like a folder in the Google Classrooms thing or something like
Yeah.
that. Okay. All right.
Can I ask you a question that's not really relevant to everybody else after everybody leaves?
Sure. Or you just email me.
Okay, cool. All right, thanks.
Mhm. I think your mic's off.
Sorry, quick question. Are there any further questions from anyone? Because I unfortunately have to remind everyone that we are 5 minutes ahead, above our time anyway. But this has been fantastic. All the digressions, all the, diversions, so to say.
Yeah.
But we do have another session coming up next week. And we also, and Sean, I think we also need to do an assignment, like 500 words of sorts before that session. Is there something which you would like for me to do before that? Send an email, create a folder or something of that sort?
Yeah, just a folder for everyone to put their work into would be great. And then everyone just submit into that.
Perfect. I'll do that and I'll share a link ASAP. Well, thank you everyone for joining in. Yeah.
Sarah, do you have a question?
Just to be clear, is the question for next week the one that starts with what is the problem of contemporary art? Oh, sorry, no, that's not right. What do the Imhoff articles offer the reader? Is that what we're working on?
No, that's the next one.
Oh, okay. So
this assignment is responding to these texts.
Oh, okay. Okay, got it.
Okay, there's somebody in the chat box who says they do not have an access to the Google Class and the materials. Can you help me with that, please? Sure thing. If you could please write to the students services, and I'm waiting for an answer. Okay, I'm writing my email ID right here. You could email me and I'll add that right there.
Oh, presentations. Yeah. I mean, I think that'll be pretty clearly. I'm not very good at structuring things, but I think we can. I think we'll just sort of people will share their writing if they'd like, or even just sort of a discussion about sort of what people are thinking about in relation to what they wrote, and we'll just have a conversation. It's not going to be a structured sort of everyone has to like present their paper or anything.
So it can be like around, so that's week 4. So it can be like on the readings or any discussion from any of the 3 sessions.
Yeah, I think yeah, the assignment I wrote for week 3, it would be presenting the assignment from week 3, which will be, due at the start of week 4. But really it's I think we can just really, I think it'll just be an opportunity for everyone to sort of reflect on what we've talked about.
Thank you.
Could we stop the recording? Oh, I suppose. Never mind.